Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today let's take a look at Rhipsalis Paradoxa, subspecies Septentrionalis. We've looked at Rhipsalis Paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa on this channel before, and that is definitely the one that is the most recognizable. It's the one that most people have in their collection. Septentrionalis is a little bit rarer. It is out there in cultivation in the United States. I think that it's just kind of one of these goofy things that I think because Rhipsalis pacheco-leonis, subspecies caduculata, it was kind of mistaken for being related to Rhipsalis paradoxa. Like some people thought that it was a subspecies, and I actually think that at one time it was classified that way. I think that Septentrionalis just kind of got pushed a little bit to the wayside, as well as I was kind of surprised because when I went to go look for the description for this in all of my various books, it wasn't actually in any of the older books. And that's because it looks like it was really first described in 1995, or at least acknowledged as a subspecies and described in 1995. So it looks like it was described in a publication that I think is called Bradleya. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. It grows in Brazil. Same thing with Rhipsalis paradoxa. It grows in Bahia, Espírito Santo, Minas Gerais, and Pernambuco. Don't know if I said all of those quite correctly. So I think that Paradoxa grows in a few different places. What's interesting is that I wanted to talk just a little bit about the whole subspecies thing and the whole form thing. So, why is this a subspecies? Generally, my understanding of this is that what we're talking about is evolution. And mind you, I am not a botanist, so this is like my layman's understanding of this. And I could be wrong. So I think that what's going on is that over time, through evolution, the plants sort of migrate, they spread, or potentially, some animal will come along and eat the berries and then go off and poop them out, and then they will grow. Birds, whatever. So over time, what ends up happening is that, maybe seeds were grown sort of off in a little bit of a distance, or it was migrating off in a little bit of a distance because of the animals. So it's kind of growing in one place and then slowly spreading to another place. And as it's spreading to another place, what is happening is evolution. And so it is slowly kind of adapting to the new environment that it is in, to the point that on these two ends of the spectrum, and it's important to what I'm saying about the two ends of the spectrum, what you have is two very distinct and recognizable subspecies. So they are both the species Paradoxa. It's just that you have the subspecies Paradoxa and the subspecies Septentrionalis. And so it's also really, really important to understand that when this happens, there will be minor differences. So there will be differences in the general way that they're growing. There will be the whole overall appearance or morphology might be a little bit different, but not so different that if it was so different that you were like, bah, that doesn't even look the same, then it would become its own species. At this point, it's not so different that it deserves a different species classification. It's just different enough that, it's recognizably different on these polar ends of these spectrums. The flower is kind of misunderstood when this happens. The flowers on subspecies will look remarkably similar, recognizably similar. You would be able to put them up next to each other and be like, these look very related. It's kind of the difference between if you look at subspecies like siblings and, you look at forms almost like twins. They're all related, and some of them actually ended up deriving from one specific species, which is actually the case with the subgenus that these are in. They all kind of derived from the same species. That's why sometimes when you look at them, they look so similar and you're like, gosh, these look really similar. And it's why sometimes they can be a little bit difficult to tell apart. I would say that Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies paradoxa, and subspecies septentrionalis is a really, really good example of this sort of subspecies classification and the understanding of how little they're going to change, you know, so it particularly when it comes to the flowers. So when it comes to the flowers, Septentrionalis' flowers are maybe just a little bit smaller, and they are shaped ever so slightly differently. They have generally the same petal count, the same sort of immersed ovary. You know, they're very, very similar, and I'm willing to bet that the fruits are so recognizably similar as well. So it's even really blooming, you know, they'll bloom from like the same general places, they'll bloom in the same general way, like recognizably, definitely similar. And so you'll see variations in things like maybe the bloom size a little bit, the bloom color a little bit, you know, so you can take something like Rhipsalis Nevis Armandii, form Nevis Armandii, and form Megalantha. You know, you've got like a difference in the size of flowers, that kind of thing. But the flowers, they generally look the same. Like you can look at them and be like, huh, that's very similar. And this is particularly true of forms, that they will look really, really similar. When it comes to subspecies, they're just recognizably similar. Like, you can see things on subspecies Septentrionalis, like maybe the petals are a little bit shorter, they're a little bit more rounded, you know, so you'll see like some differences like that. And with forms, one of the interesting things is that forms, again, they are on recognizable ends of spectrums, right? So like you can be like, oh, you know, they're all growing in the same place. So it's not quite like Septentrionalis and Paradoxa, where they actually kind of went off and grew in separate places. And so now they actually have kind of a different distribution. When it comes to forms, they're actually growing in the same place. So they're still growing, they have the same distribution, and they just are kind of spontaneously sort of mutating into a little bit of a different form. And it's all evolution. So that's why forms, very particularly, you will notice very similar growth patterns. And then you will notice, you know, obviously the flowers will generally be the same. I love this plant. I really do love this plant. It's kind of a kooky plant. It's like, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit weird. When I first got it, I was like, huh, that plant is just real awkward. But as it's kind of growing, it's, you know, it's really interesting to me. And obviously these blooms, I mean, the blooming was just fantastic. Honestly, I thought I was going to end up with one bloom, because one bloom just sort of came out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden, I looked at the plant and I was like, oh my goodness, there's a whole bunch of buds forming. The funny thing is that you can't actually see the buds forming. So when the buds start to form, because they have that immersed ovary, it's buried inside of the branch. So when it actually starts to form, what ends up happening is that you can't even really see the buds start to form. You don't really see the bud until it is pretty well formed. And then it just sort of busts through the branches. So like this right here, you know, it will be just a little bit less formed than that by the time it punches its way out of the branches. So it's almost ready to bloom. And so that's what was really funny, is that's how I sort of just was like, oh, I'm going to get one bloom. And that's kind of a normal thing for Rhipsalis. Kind of a funny thing. So you'll have a Rhipsalis for like 2 years, 3 years or whatever. And then it will bloom, and it will probably have a sparse blooming its first bloom. It's not always the case, but it's usually the case. And then the next year, it'll probably just explode in blooms. And so I thought I was going to get one little, you know, measly bloom out of this. And instead it was like, JK. And it threw out just tons and tons of blooms after the fact, which I think is really funny, because Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa, also bloomed for the very first time this year. And what was really interesting is that it only had blooms on like 2 branches. So it had sparse blooms. And so I would imagine next year it will probably have a larger, more blooms on it, whereas this year it did not. So I do want to hit the description. The description really isn't much. I think it's gone through multiple different names in terms of Rhipsalis paradoxa. Like Rhipsalis paradoxa was known as Rhipsalis paradoxum. It was a lepismium at one time. So Rhipsalis paradoxa has gone through a couple of names, but I don't think that it had, I'm going to guess that by 1995 it was pretty settled into being a Rhipsalis. So the only description is in the New Cactus Lexicon by David Hunt. In terms of like my books that I have, there are publications where there are other descriptions. But essentially the only thing that it really says here is kind of a subset of Paradoxa's description. And then it basically just says that the branches and wings are much narrower and that the flower is yellow. So that's not the first time that I've heard that. And I think that what's a little bit kooky about that is that the flowers, when they very first open, they're actually kind of a little bit of a pink and they have very small hints of yellow. I would imagine that if you put it in very strong sunlight, you'll probably get some more colors, some more intense colors that will come out of there. I don't know if the intense color will be yellow or not really. But again, if we come in here and we look at the bud, there are hints of pink on there. So when it very first opens, kind of like this, you'll see that there are hints of pink that are on the flower. Right? And so I don't know that I would say that it is immediately yellow. However, the blooms last for a few days. So what you see here is blooms in a bunch of various different stages on this branch. So you can see like one that here, right there, which might be, a day old and it's starting to look kind of yellow. And then this one might be about 2 days old and it's even more yellow. And then, these are probably about 4 days old. And so now they're intense yellow. There you go. So, like this one's probably about 3 days old and it's very intensely yellow. And actually what's really interesting about that is that I remember reading in a book or seeing a picture in a book where the flower was like intensely yellow. And I think that's kind of a strange thing because actually Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa, the blooms start out very similarly. So they start out, they've got a little bit of a pink on them, and then the next day they're a little bit yellow, and then the next day they're a little more yellow. But I would say that the real big difference there is that the intensity of yellow that they fade to, it is a little bit more intense on subspecies Septentrionalis is all. One more thing that I definitely want to hit on is this scent. So it is fragrant. It is not quite like anything that I have ever smelled before. So, it has a floral scent, but not a sweet floral scent. And I would say that it is a little bit like spicy. So it was kind of hard for me to try to figure out how to describe that. It's a little bit spicy. And I would actually say that it is it's somewhere in between kind of like a feminine and a masculine smell. I don't even know how to say this. So like, I always had a really hard time using women's body wash because it is like cloyingly sweet and I don't like how sweet it is. So I would use men's body wash, but I would use men's body wash that had a little bit more of a feminine kind of smell to it. So I would say that it's kind of funny because to me it's a little bit more of like an ambiguous body wash, which is neither feminine nor masculine. It's just kind of like somewhere in between that. I know that's kind of a dumb description, but it's very difficult to describe how this smells. It is a wonderful smell. It might actually be the most wonderful smelling Rhipsalis I've ever smelled to date. And it's not a real strong fragrance. You know what? I feel like it would be kind of like if you mixed a little bit of sandalwood with a little bit of vanilla. Like, that might be a good way to describe it. You see what I mean? Like, vanilla and sandalwood together. Like, it's kind of like a woodsy sort of sweet smell, but not like real sweet. So it's got that little bit of spice. It's really, really a wonderful smell. Like, I can't stop smelling it. It's just absolutely fantastic. So also on the note of the subspecies and on the note of forms, it's kind of a bit of a goofy thing because you will have, especially in the wild, like we don't see it at home, you know, like we don't see it when we don't live in these places. Like if you don't live in Brazil, this is not going to be a normal thing for you to see. If you're living in a different country and you're just collecting Rhipsalis, you're going to get them more along the lines of like the houseplant market. And in the houseplant market, you're more likely to actually get the very distinct subspecies. But every once in a while, you'll end up with a plant that's kind of like, I don't know how to identify this because it's somewhere in between Rhipsalis paradoxa and Rhipsalis paradoxa subspecies Septentrionalis. That is normal. That it's not like it's a completely new subspecies or whatever. It's just normal because, like in Brazil, what you would see is a whole bunch of intergrades here. So you would see like a bunch of different plants that are somewhere in between. So what's cool is that you would actually be able to see the evolution, right? So again, with subspecies, we're just talking about recognizably on the two ends of the spectrums, but there are definitely Rhipsalis paradoxas that have an appearance everywhere in between that. And that is completely okay and completely normal. It is not wrong to basically just say, you know, it's Rhipsalis paradoxa, because guess what? It's actually not wrong to say that this is Rhipsalis paradoxa. So if you drop the subspecies off, it's not wrong. It's just, you know, for collecting purposes or whatever, or, you know, like purposes of a more definite identification kind of thing, if it's on the ends of the spectrum, using the subspecies is a good idea because then collectors can definitely kind of, you know, collect. I also kind of want to say something else that's a little bit funny about Rhipsalis in general. So a lot of times I see things where, you know, people would look at this and they would be like, oh my goodness, you know, how long did that take? And they think that it took like years and years and years and years. No. Rhipsalis are really fast growing. Almost every Rhipsalis is really fast growing. So you can get like some cuttings, some small, you know, cuttings of a plant or whatever. And generally you'll end up growing it out in like 2 to 3 years into something quite substantial. Rhipsalis are just fast growing. So I do just want to say that because I think sometimes it's like, whoa, you know, the paradoxes that are behind here, like those paradoxes are over 5 feet long. And the one on the right I bought as kind of more of established plant, but the one on the left I actually bought as cuttings. And the one on the left is the longer one. And I actually did a video when I very first planted those cuttings quite a while back. And I believe that there were 2 cuttings. And so those 2 little cuttings that I planted in probably about 3 years grew into a plant that's over 5 feet long. So they are not slow growing, which is one of the reasons why they're awesome growing, you know, because they grow really fast and it's really fun to watch them grow because they're very active. So they make beautiful houseplants and everything, just regardless of the blooms. If we go in here too, I want to kind of make a note about, because, you know, we talk about the ovary being immersed or whatever, and it's kind of a weird thing because I think that that kind of gets lost in translation a little bit. You know what I'm talking about, like the flower just kind of like punches through the stem. Well, it started developing inside of there and was quite developed by the time that it actually busted through the stem, which I already said. But the key to this is what is missing. So if we look at, there we go. So if we look at a bud there, you can see how it like kind of alien punched its way through the branch, but it's what's not there. What you don't see is the ovary, because the ovary is actually immersed inside of the branch. That's the thing about the subgenus Calamorhipsalis that makes them Calamorhipsalis, right? Because their ovaries, their pericarpal, it's immersed inside of there. And so you don't see it. It's not visible here. And when we look at the flowers, you can see that it's still not visible. So even like when it's opened blooming, it's still not visible. And I don't see it on here yet, because I don't know that any of these flowers have died off very well yet. Like there's the very first bloom that bloomed. It's very dead down there. Huh. So we still don't see it there. You know, you can see that it, you know, punched its way out. I don't really see a berry forming yet, but there might be a berry forming and I just wouldn't see it because it's buried under there. So that is also, once that flower dies, if a berry forms, even if the flower falls off, there will be a scar on this branch. So here is actually some cuttings that I got. These are just cuttings. They might be mildly rooted here. I got these last year. And so here you can see right there where it is previously bloomed, there is a scar that's there. So that's like the ovary was literally down in there. And we would see what was really interesting about this. I don't see any of them anymore, which is kind of sad. I think I took pictures of it though. But one question that a person might have is, can it actually bloom again from the same areole? Like now that the areole is, well, I also want to kind of give props to these cuttings, because like this seems like it's considerably easier to bloom than Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa. I'll definitely say that. The question there is, will it bloom again? So like now that it's bloomed out of those areoles, can it do it again? Yes, it can. So as long as the pericarpal that's buried under there didn't actually get damaged in some way, it appears as though they can bloom again. How many times can they bloom again? I'm not really sure. You can see like Paradoxa, it also has the spent blooms. You can see that they're yellow. You can see that you also can't really see the ovary there. So you really can't see it. And actually, let me grab something where you can see it so it's very clear as to what I'm saying. Yeah, so we'll look at Rhipsalis ewaldiana here. It's close to me. But see how with Rhipsalis ewaldiana, you can see, oh, this is like really hard to grab a hold of this. Had to grab a tiny one, didn't I? Ow. It looks like I may have missed one of those flowers opening. All right, so with ewaldiana, you can see how you can see this little bit that's down here, and you can also see how it's like on the surface of the branch. So that's the ovary. So the ovary is below the petals here, where like the petals are still closed and the flower is actually forming. So that would be where an ovary is not immersed in the branch. So this guy here is a really good example of something that, you know, it had like one flower, like 1 or 2 flowers on it last year. And then this year it's like, boom, let me explode. Still not even a very big plant. But this one is Rhipsalis grandiflora. And so Rhipsalis grandiflora kind of makes me laugh because I'm like, what an appropriate name. You can see, trying to get a hold of one of these branches. So here you can see the ovary, right? It's on the surface of the branch. It's not actually buried in there. And then you can see the petals forming is really kind of making up the tip of the flower bud. And so particularly on this one, once, here you can see, like when they very first start forming, they're just kind of these like little nubs. They don't like swell underneath the areole or like, start to kind of like alien their way out of the branches. And then after flowering, while these branches do kind of scar a little bit, here you can see a little bit of scarring, they don't leave giant craters. It's really more of like a little surface scar, maybe a little tiny, might actually start to see some spines or things like that that weren't there previously after flowering. Maybe a little bit of wool or, probably not too much wool. That's kind of also a Calamorhipsalis thing to produce lots of wool, but sometimes some of the other ones have like a little tiny bit of wool after flowering. Back to Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa. Kind of want to point out the growth pattern here is pretty much the same. So Rhipsalis paradoxa looks like it has these big, long branches, but what's going on here is that actually each branch segment is only about this long, right? So it's only about that long. And you can see the joint right there, and then there's a joint right here. And so each time that Rhipsalis paradoxa grows a branch segment, and this is when they don't grow like continuously to unknown different lengths, it's called determinate. So it has a determinate growth pattern here. So the branch segments are determinate. And the reason why it sometimes looks like it's just this very, very long continuous thing is just because sometimes it grows one new branch segment out of the end of an old branch segment. But that is not always the case, right? So here's one where it's actually grown 3. And these will all grow to be about the same length. And then from the ends of their branches, they will grow, 1, 2, 3. I've only ever seen a maximum of 3. But maybe they can grow 4. But I've only ever seen the maximum of 3 on my plants. And so the branch segments here are considerably thicker than Septentrionalis, right? So they are just much thicker. You can see there. And so the chain links actually look like they're a little bit longer. These are technically, all these branches are technically 3-angled, but because it actually kind of switches, it kind of twists like this, and it'll be alternating. So it's alternating 3 angles. And that is the exact same case for Septentrionalis. It's alternating 3 angles. And I want to point out like how similar the growth pattern is on these, as well. Like Septentrionalis will also only grow branch segments about this length. So it also has determinate branch segments, and it grows in the exact same kind of pattern. And depending on how much or how little light it gets, the branch segments can actually get very, very thick, really quite thick, not as thick as paradoxas will get, but they can get quite thick. So generally, because it's thinner though, and it's not quite as heavy, it has a little bit more of a spread out look. So if these were thicker and they were heavier, it would bow down more like this, and it would end up looking considerably more like Rhipsalis paradoxa, subspecies Paradoxa. I just kind of want to point that out just because sometimes with a plant, with a Rhipsalis, you might have like an overall kind of habit, and you might actually think that the overall way that it's growing makes it look like it's a completely different species, but sometimes it's actually the real fine details about how those branch segments, how long they are, like how they're actually growing. Like, these are growing out of the ends. They're not just kind of randomly growing out of areoles on the sides, typically, unless you damage the end of the branch, right? If you were to damage the ends of these branches, they would grow branches from further up. But generally, if it's left undamaged, they will grow out of the ends. I live in Minnesota, so I actually have to move my plants in and out during the winter. They come in during the winter, they come out during the summer. So a lot of times you can see different kinds of growth. Like this is more spring growth, and you can see that the branch segment is quite a bit thicker than some of the other ones that we've looked at. But the same thing actually happens with my Paradoxa, right? Like I'll get thinner and thicker branches from the moving in and out and in and out, right? So there you go. I mean, it's just kind of a goofy thing that can happen. So they can get like etiolated from not having enough light. The chaining can get very, very dense if they're in very high light, like it can get very tight and close. This isn't even really in highlight. Not really. They're in quite a bit of shade. But I just kind of want to point that out too, just as one of those things. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at Rhipsalis paradoxa subspecies Septentrionalis with me. Thank you for watching, and happy cacti growing.